Well, welcome to our Produce Safety Rule webinar series, where we talk about tools and information that will help support your knowledge of and compliance with the Federal Produce Safety Rule. So today we are going to discuss on-farm readiness reviews. All right. So first, because we are talking about tools that support your knowledge and compliance, we'll just do a real brief overview of the Food Safety Modernization Act's Produce Safety Rule. We'll talk about what on-farm readiness reviews are, and then how you can request one. So that's what we'll cover in today's webinar. Again, the webinar will only last for 30 minutes, and that will include time for question and answer. And if you need to leave in the middle or you want to pass this information on to somebody else, it will be recorded and posted on the website coproducesafety.org on our webinar page. So you can find it there too, the recording. So today, there are two of us presenting, Christy Dice, who's the Produce Safety Rule Program Manager with the Colorado Department of Agriculture, and myself, Martha Sullins. I'm an Extension Specialist with Colorado State University Extension. So first, just a really quick review about the Produce Safety Rule. So as you recall, the Produce Safety Rule is the first ever mandatory federal standard that governs the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fruits and vegetables. So it was signed into law in 2011 and went into effect in January 2016. And it is one of a suite of 7 rules that is designed to protect the U.S. produce supply chain. So not all produce growers are covered by the rule, so we just wanted to do a quick review of that. And so the Produce Safety Rule does cover farmers who grow, harvest, pack, and hold produce that is consumed raw. And so if you have any questions about what that produce might comprise, so what are raw agricultural commodities, you can find links on coproducesafety.org. And as well as growers who sell over $25,000 in total produce sales. And so those are sales of produce into commerce. So again, if you have any questions about what produce is subject to the rule, please refer to our website, and you can also link directly to FDA. So even if you fall in that category, there are some operations that are subject to a modified version of the Produce Safety Rule. And so just a couple of situations are, one, if a grower has produce that is commercially processed, so then that grower would be subject to a modified exemption under the rule. And so commercially processed means that produce is subject to a kill step, which is a validated process that is known to significantly reduce the presence of microorganisms. And so examples of that would be canning, distilling, pasteurizing of a fruit juice, making wine from grapes or other fruit. So that would be one example where you would be subject to a modified version of the rule and not the full rule. A second case is for farms that have total food sales of less than $500,000 who sell directly to consumers, or they're known as end users, qualified end users in the rule. And those farms are in Colorado, but the consumers are in Colorado or within 275 miles of the farm in question. And so note that the qualified end users or consumers might be consumers who purchase directly at a farm stand or a CSA. They might buy online or through a restaurant or a retail food establishment. But that would just be another case where a farm would be subject only to a modified version of the rule. So if you're not sure whether you are covered by the rule or to what extent, you can go to coproducesafety.org. There's a sidebar on the website, and it says learn if you're covered by the produce safety rule. And there's an exemption decision tool that you can use to walk you through whether you're covered by the rule. So again, if you'd like more information, you can visit our website. We are also only a phone call away, and so you can see contact information for Christy Dice with the Colorado Department of Agriculture, Danielle Dunai, as well as myself at CSU Extension, and you can contact us by phone or by email for additional information. So today we're going to talk about on-farm readiness reviews and their role in supporting compliance with the produce safety rule. And so what an on-farm readiness review is a way for you to use an educational tool and understand how the produce safety rule applies to your farm, help you understand what you're doing well in terms of complying with the produce safety rule, as well as seeing what types of adjustments or improvements you might need to make in practices, types of equipment you're using, training, and we'll talk about all that in a little bit more depth. But we like to think of it as, we'll take some of the questions out of compliance with the produce safety rule, so those what ifs. So an on-farm readiness review is not an obligation. It's not a requirement. It is a totally voluntary, non-regulatory educational opportunity. So you can request an on-farm readiness review, but you are not required to have one under the produce safety rule. But what it is it's a visit by educators and the Colorado Department of Agriculture staff to your farm just to observe what your food safety practices are at the time of the visit, and then have a discussion with you and provide some feedback on how those practices align with produce safety rule requirements. And our goal is really to provide as many on-farm readiness review opportunities as possible before inspections start under the produce safety rule. So we think there are a lot of benefits in terms of the on-farm readiness review being a really good learning opportunity for you. So again, it is voluntary and it's entirely confidential. And so any notes that we take, we leave with you at the farm. We don't talk about what happens on the on-farm readiness review to anybody else. It is really just a discussion on your farm on the date we set that up for you to learn more about how your on-farm practices align with the produce safety rule. And again, we want to help you understand how you can make some possible improvements before inspections start. And then the last thing is, providing those suggestions, some follow-up information and educational materials that might be helpful. And you get to choose when, if you want to do an on-farm readiness review, you choose when you want to do that. So you make an appointment with the Colorado Department of Agriculture if you want to sign up for one. So during that on-farm readiness review, as I mentioned, I said us, so that's a small team of staff from the Colorado Department of Agriculture, and then probably one other person from CSU Extension who comes out to do that visit. And so again, the goal is having that discussion about your on-farm food safety practices. Our goal is not to provide information that will help you meet certain third-party buyer or audit requirements, but it's really looking at how your practices align with the produce safety rule and what you're doing now, not what you think might be what we might want to hear or what you think you might be doing at some point in time. And so, and we really will only cover what is happening on your farm when we visit. And so, for example, if you don't use any soil amendments of animal origin, then we're not going to talk about biological soil amendments of animal origin with you. We're only going to look at the parts of the produce safety rule that apply to your operation. So again, we've made an appointment and we come out, and what we're going to do is use what's called a walk-around questionnaire. So it's really just a guiding document that helps us talk to you about elements of the produce safety rule, and just ask you some questions so we can understand what's happening on your farm and where there might be areas we would want to discuss further and maybe point out to you. We do want to walk around the entire farm. And so, what we want to do is start by understanding what's happening on your farm that day, and then really adjust that visit to take into consideration anything that is really important that we might want to see, areas that we might want to avoid. So we would want to visit harvesting. And so if you're harvesting first thing in the morning, we would want to start there to be able to observe harvest practices and then move to other parts of the farm. We certainly don't want to interfere with farm operations, but we do want to get a good perspective and be able to have a really good discussion. We do want to talk about the produce safety rule and not kind of drift into other areas. And so we look at this as your opportunity to take everything that you learned about the produce safety rule in the grower training class and then talk about it on your farm. And that kind of brings up another point, is that it is really important that you attend the Produce Safety Alliance grower training course before having an on-farm readiness review, because in that way you are just so much more familiar with the rule, and you will have already thought through how the standards apply to your farm, but then you get that on the ground perspective. So we think it makes the visit much more effective, and it really makes it a lot more meaningful to you because you already have that basic understanding. And so, Christy, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you, Martha. So we'll talk a little bit now about what we're going to look at and what we're going to review when we do the on-farm readiness review. So because we want to walk around the farm and talk about your food safety practices, farms should really have some growing activities occurring for discussion, and ideally maybe some harvesting activities as well. And so that's so we can look at all of the parts of the farm and really observe the practices that are occurring while those activities are going. We're going to talk about food safety practices related to the standards of the produce safety rule. So we're going to look at the worker health and hygiene, biological soil amendments of animal origin, your pre-harvest, harvest, and post-harvest activities, domesticated animals and wildlife, so any animals, working animals that you're using, or the wildlife intrusion into fields, we'll talk about those things, pre- and post-harvest sanitation, and then we'll talk a little bit about agricultural water. As we've discussed in the Produce Safety Alliance grower trainings, the whole agricultural water subpart is under review and not being enforced at this time, but we'll really still want to talk about good agricultural practices relating to your water usage. So we won't go into a lot of details about the specifics of the rule in relation to agricultural water, but we'll still talk about some good practices in relation to the water. Next slide. So what types of questions are we going to ask when we come out? So we're going to ask a lot of open-ended questions, which means we want to give you guys the opportunity to describe what your food safety practices look like on your farm. We're going to try not to ask you questions that you can answer yes or no to. We'll want you to really describe the process and the practice that you're doing. So some of those questions might include, what policies do you have for health and hygiene? When do you train your employees? How do you determine if you've had animal intrusion into your fields? What do you do if you find evidence of animal intrusion in the field? Do you inspect your equipment, containers, vehicles prior to or during harvest? Do you sanitize your containers, tools, or equipment? If so, do you keep records of those activities? What is your policy on dropped covered produce? How do you prevent contamination of harvested produce? So you can see by those questions that those are questions where we want you to describe the process. We don't want to, sit down and look at a written document that describes those. We really want to hear what you have to say about each one of those areas that we cover in the Produce Safety Alliance grower training. Next slide. So Martha mentioned a little bit, but we just wanted to also cover a little bit about what an on-farm readiness review does not do. So as she mentioned, it does not prepare you for a third-party audit or those buyer-required audits. You were really there just talking about the produce safety rule. It likely will not be repeated on a farm unless there's a change in personnel that requires another on-farm readiness review. So ideally, we'll come out and do an on-farm readiness review, discuss your practices, leave you with some things to maybe improve upon, and then the next visit you would get from produce safety personnel would be the inspection. So our goal is really to have this on-farm readiness review be prior to an inspection and only be once. In the event that your food safety person leaves, or the person that we completed the on-farm readiness review with, if they end up leaving your farm, then we of course would work you into the rotation of getting another on-farm readiness review. It's not going to include a review of your food safety plan. So a food safety plan isn't required under the produce safety rule. It can certainly help with compliance with the rule, but it's not required. And so again, because we're going to be walking around the farm, we're not going to sit down and look at a binder full of food safety standard operating procedures. There won't be a real focus on records and required under the produce safety rule. If a grower is interested in us reviewing them to see if they're complete and include all the parts that are necessary, we certainly will. But again, it's just the walking around is and talking about the practices is what's going to be important. Next slide. How long will an on-farm readiness review take? So ideally, it'll be about half a day, depending on the size of the farm. It could be a little bit shorter. It could be a little bit longer if it's a very large farm and we're trying to get around to a bunch of different fields or sites. But we're going to try and respect the farmer's time while still giving enough time to discuss the rule and how the rule applies to their farm, and allowing the grower to have all the time he needs to ask the questions that they have. But we really want to try and keep it shorter than a full day, just so that the farmer can also get to all the other things that he has to do in one day or another day. Next slide. So we want to just give you guys some information about if there is a problem that's observed during an on-farm readiness review. We understand that the requirements of the produce safety rule are new, and that many farmers are going to see some areas where they can make some improvements while we're out there doing the on-farm readiness review, or maybe some areas where they're not quite compliant with the rule. So we're really anticipating that will be the bulk of what we're talking about when we're out there doing the on-farm readiness reviews. In the rare event that there's a condition of significant public health concern, or we also call it an egregious condition, is observed, that we're going to work with you as the farmer to ensure that public health is protected. So this would be something where serious adverse health consequences or death from the consumption of or exposure to covered produce is observed. So it's going to be something very, very serious. Also, if an imminent public health hazard is posed, if corrective action is not taken immediately, those are going to be the things we're going to look further into and figure out how the best way to rectify the situation is. So an example could be portions of produce contacting a source of contamination. So a specific example could be if you have a porta potty out in your field where you're harvesting and it's leaking out and leaking onto covered produce. That would be a situation where we would need to take further action, make sure that the produce that was harvested from that area is not being put into commerce where it might potentially make people sick. We anticipate that this is going to be very rare that we see this type of situation occur on a farm. We have a plan if we need to, and we like to let farmers know what would happen if we did see something. But again, we just really feel like this will be something we're not going to see very frequently. Next slide, please. So how can a grower prepare for an on-farm readiness review? This is a question I get a lot from farmers. What can I do to get ready for this? And so some good things to think about or take into consideration would be, review your food safety practices on your farm prior to us coming out. And think about any questions you may have about the rule. So as you went through the PSA grower training and you're out now at your farm thinking about your food safety practices, what questions do you have about the rule? Another thing is really figuring out who the best people to participate in the on-farm readiness review will be. So again, somebody who's attended the PSA grower training, somebody who knows your on-farm food safety practices, which could be your food safety manager if you have a specific person for that. It could be a few people if you have a few people that do food safety practices and are in charge of your policies on your farm. It could be a few people. The one thing that we do like to point out that maybe it might be good to have a decision maker on the on-farm readiness review as well, even if they're not well versed in your food safety practices. That would allow for some future planning of upgrades. So if we talk about something during the on-farm readiness review that might require an expenditure of funds or again upgrading, it'd be good to have that person there as well so they have the opportunity to hear it firsthand and ask any questions that they may have. Again, this isn't something that we anticipate would be required by the rule that you would have to spend, some money to make an upgrade, but it could just be helpful for you as a farmer looking at your operation and what maybe you could update. And then another thing that we are working diligently on to try and have available for growers is the produce safety rule readiness tool. So this is going to be an online tool that walks farmers through each part of the rule and helps them determine compliance with the rule. It'll be like I said, an online version where you can go in and look at the different parts of the rule and click some check boxes to see how you are complying with the rule or where you maybe need to make some adjustments. So that'll be coming out soon. We're hoping to have that ready potentially by the end of April. So look for that on our coproducesafety.org website. Next slide. Is there any follow-up after the on-farm readiness review? So when we complete the on-farm readiness review with the farmer, there is a manual that the farmer will get. So it's a good-sized manual that covers all parts of the rule and covers everything that we've covered during the on-farm readiness review. Any notes that we may have taken as we've walked around will be included in the on-farm readiness review manual. So that's a resource for the farmer to review after we leave. Any resources or technical support that the farmer needs will be sent from CSU Extension, so some follow-up might come from that if there's questions around some best practices. CSU Extension will be able to provide those resources. And then if there's any unanswered questions, so because this rule is new and we're all trying to figure it out, there could be some times where we have some questions where we're just not sure of, and so we're going to take those back and make sure that we get an educated and correct response to those questions. So those will be provided to the farmer afterwards. And then the Department of Agriculture created a simple survey for farmers to fill out. We want this to really be valuable for farmers. It's an anonymous survey, so the farmer would just log in and complete a few simple questions about the process that we'll use as we go forward to make this process even better for our farmers. And then, as always, farmers can contact us with any additional questions or resource requests that they may have. We are open always to helping you guys figure out what you need for the rule and what we can create to help make it a little bit easier for you to comply with the rule. Next slide. So we did talk about this a little bit in the beginning, but who can request a non-farm readiness review? All size growers, so even if you're exempt from the rule, if you qualify for one of those exemptions that Martha talked about, or if you're completely exempt from the rule, we will try and fit you into our schedule as far as coming out and doing an on-farm readiness review. Our farms that are covered by the rule will be prioritized first, so the all other farms or the farms that sell over $500,000 in produce, they're required to be compliant with the rule now, and so they'll be on our priority list. But when we come out to an area, we're going to try and maximize our time in that area, so we might pick up a few of the smaller ones or exempt ones at that time. And then again, farmers need to take the Produce Safety Alliance grower training before an on-farm readiness review. It helps us ensure that the discussion is about food safety practices and how they align with the rule rather than spending a lot of time describing what's included in the rule or terminology around the rule. Next slide, please. So if you're interested in an on-farm readiness review, you can go to our coproducesafety.org website, and there's a button on there that you can click that'll take you to a basic form that just captures a few minimal elements from you, so we can follow up with you about having an on-farm readiness review. You can always contact us by email, phone, or in person. And then look for us to follow up with you to schedule a time that works for you. We're getting closer to our growing season now, so we're going to start working on our outdoor growers as their activities allow, as they start having produce in the field that we can observe, and employees out there harvesting and things going on in their packing shed. So we're getting ready to gear up and get this thing rolling for the summer. Next slide. So that's the end of our discussion on on-farm readiness reviews. We hope that was helpful, and hopefully you guys got something out of this. We have another webinar scheduled for May 15th where we're going to talk about the produce safety rule inspections. So if you're interested in learning about that, please tune in. It'll be 30 minutes again over the lunchtime hour. You can connect via this link on the slide, or you can go to our coproducesafety.org website and go to the calendar, and you can also access the login information there as well. Next slide. So with that, again, thank you all very much for tuning in and for getting on the call. If you have any questions, you can enter them in the Q&A box, or you can just speak, and we will do our best to answer them right now. So we'll look for those. And I don't think we have any questions in the queue right now, but does anybody on the line have any questions?
Well, Christy, I don't hear any questions. And if you do come up with a question afterward, you can just feel free to email or call, as Christy said, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have.